Welcome back to the first video, the first real video, the first event video in this series on how to get full marks in the AQA Significance, Power and the People questions at GCSE. So if you haven't watched my first video about the structure, about the basic approach, I do suggest you go watch that first so you know exactly what's coming and you can really understand what I'm going to go through in this video. But today I'm going to look at the Magna Carta, the first event really that you look at in that scheme of work, and the first real event we can kind of get down to and plan out how you would answer this essay question. So, Magna Carta. Now, you don't need to know everything about the event to answer this question because, as I said in the previous video, the most important thing you do is answer and link to the question. Now, this case, it's significance. Why was it important? Why was it relevant? What did it change? However, it would be useful to remember the Magna Carta is signed at Runnymede, which is near Windsor. It was signed in 1215 and it was signed between King John and his barons. Now, there are obviously lots of reasons it was signed. For this particular question, we don't need to worry so much about those reasons. First thing I'm going to do is brainstorm the most important outcomes of this document. So I'm thinking, first of all, it limited the king's power. Now, in order to elevate that vocabulary, which is something I'm going to talk about a lot, because to get grade 9, we need to not only follow the structure that I gave you previously, we need to include those academic points that I described in the last video, points that are not obvious, not from the textbook, but we need to elevate our vocabulary. So we're going to add in the word arbitrary. Now, arbitrary is a word we can use to describe when a king essentially is able to do whatever he likes. He can do this, he can do that. No one has the power to stop him. So Magna Carta was the first document that really started limiting that arbitrary power the king had. It had 63 promises and it increased the power of the barons. So that's my basic kind of overview of what Magna Carta achieved. Now I'm going to try and work out from that overview what then are the relevant, significant points in the short term. How did it change life? Well, as I know, it limited the king's power, or it limited his arbitrary power. So I'm going to change that, quite simply put, bullet point to it restricted his arbitrary power. Better vocabulary, sounds more intelligent, more likely to get higher marks. Secondly, I brainstormed previously that it gave more power to the barons. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing as I just did, and I'm going to elevate that vocabulary. So rather than saying it gave power to the barons, I'm going to say it created greater individual liberty, liberty meaning freedom. So individuals under this society gained greater freedoms. And it was the first document forced onto the king by his subjects. Now, I don't need to change this vocabulary that much. It's already okay as it is. They're all the positive things. They're all the really positive things for the subjects of the king under his rule. I'm going to think quickly about some of the things which maybe might not be described as positive at the time. However, they are still significant. Remember in my first video, I explained that to be significant, it just needs to be relevant, important, or lead to change. That change can be positive, that change can be negative. So for the barons at the time, for the subjects of the king, these points are all positives, these ones not so much, but we're still going to include them. So within Magna Carta, they use the term free men. Now, that excludes around 80% of the population. The 80% of the population at this time are what we would call villeins. Now, villeins are tied to the land. A villain is a bit like a peasant, if that makes it easier for you to understand. And villeins made up 80% of the population. So they are not able to leave the land they work on. They're not able to move around or have mobility. And it also means they're not given the same rights as free men. So Magna Carta does not apply to them. It doesn't help these people. It's also very limited in scope. And by scope, what I mean is how broad and what these terms apply to. So in this instance, the terms really only apply to cases of taxation and inheritance. Now, as you can imagine, taxation, inheritance really only apply to the barons. So what we're seeing from these two pieces of information is that Magna Carta was quite exclusive in who it brought greater freedom to or greater individual liberty. It's not the whole population, it's a minority of people. Now, in addition, as you know, if you know about the event, you'll know that John actually, while he signs the document and he signs it in June, by August, he has already broken this promise. So we can say that John just doesn't comply with Magna Carta, and therefore this would limit its significance. It would limit it because it's not holding, it doesn't change things for very long. So all these points here would actually perhaps limit the significance a little bit because they're negative points. They're things which aren't bringing positive change. Now, they're also not bringing negative change, but what they are doing is they are limiting who this is able to change life for. Now, as I said, significance can be positive, can be negative, but it's all about change. Now, if this limits the number of people that are affected, that are helped, therefore it limits the significance. So if I was writing an essay on this, I would start by saying Magna Carta is very significant in the short term for these reasons. However, its significance is also limited because it only applied to free men, it excluded the villeins, who were 80% of the population. It was also very limited in scope. It mostly spoke about taxation and inheritance, and John simply doesn't comply with it. So therefore, its significance, its impact is quite short-lived. And that would be my first paragraph. Now, my second paragraph, obviously, as we know, needs to be on the long term. So this is where Magna Carta really comes into its own in terms of significance, because it is undoubtedly very significant still today. And actually, Magna Carta is a document we might say gains relevance over time. For example, the term in Magna Carta, habeas corpus, is still used in numerous facets, in numerous ways, in numerous examples today. Now, one point habeas corpus is really important for is habeas corpus essentially means being given a free and fair trial. Now, in the case of Muhammadu Slahi, who is the example I'm going to give you, he was held in Guantanamo Bay detention center without trial, and his lawyer, Nancy Hollander, used Magna Carta habeas corpus at his trial to get him freed, essentially, rather than having him stand trial for the crimes he was accused of. She actually sued the US government for habeas corpus and said that he was being held unfairly against his will. He'd been held there for around 7-8 years before this trial even happened. So she used Magna Carta in a very modern day case, which shows that it's still relevant, it's still making change today. Now, Magna Carta was also copied into parts of the US Constitution. For example, the phrase that I've put here, no free man ought to be deprived of his life. And that was directly inserted into the American Constitution that was created after the American War of Independence against the British. Still around today, still relevant, still important. And it was also used in the UN Declaration of Human Rights that was written in 1948. So as we can see, Magna Carta is actually still incredibly relevant today. It's relevant for law cases, and particular example of a trial would be Muhammadu Slahi. It was included in the US Constitution and the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Now, the last point I'm going to talk about, well, actually, it's not that it's the second to last point I'm going to talk about, is that Magna Carta has also been seen as being very inspirational for many other movements, particularly to do with liberty and freedom. For example, the English Civil War, the American Revolution, the Chartist movement in Britain. You can also include the suffragettes. The suffragettes used quotes from Magna Carta in their pamphlets that they sent out to people to try and persuade them to follow them. All these people are using this historic moment where the people held the king to account in order to prove and to try and justify their own rights to liberty and their own rights to freedom. Now, that's really important. That's really, really relevant. Now, the last point I'm just going to talk about is this idea that Magna Carta to this day is kind of seen as a romanticized symbol of liberty, of freedom. Now, the one example I'm going to give you, because remember those really precise academic examples are what we want, is that of Arthur Beardmore. Now, Arthur Beardmore was arrested in 1762, and he was arrested for the crime of seditious libel. Now, seditious libel is essentially where you're being arrested for kind of treasonous writing. The government thought what he was writing, what he was publishing was treasonous, because it was particularly about liberty and the rights of the ordinary man. Now, how he used Magna Carta in his arrest was that he ensured he was reading his son Magna Carta as the guards burst in and arrested him. So he really romanticized the idea of Magna Carta in order to bring some significance to his kind of martyrdom as such, of being arrested. And that's really interesting because it shows that, you know, he really saw Magna Carta as highly important, even in 1762, all these kind of, you know, a bit less than 500 years later. So there is kind of my essay plan as such for this essay. Now, if you were to follow that completely, you would have all of the information you need to write a really excellent full marks answer. Thinking about vocabulary, making sure you include, you know, arbitrary power, restriction of arbitrary power, the creation of individual liberty, the significance to later generations, really important, and getting in those blue bits of information I've put on the screen now and that I went through earlier on, where you're really using precise examples. What I would suggest is that you make notes from this, is that you get this information down, and I've put my Instagram in the description bar below. Now, at the moment, I haven't posted a huge amount on there, but what I want to do is start posting model answers, or giving you links to documents that might really support your revision. So if you start following me, you might, you know, you'll be there just to make sure you catch that information as it comes. So thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful. Subscribe if you haven't, because I'm going to keep this series going and I'll be posting the next event very, very shortly.